I'm having a hard time
We're
today.
back.
I'm not gonna lie. Oh, we're back.
We're back. We're back. Technical difficulties.
Yeah, I don't know why. Like the internet decided to make us not live anymore. But okay,
Steve, maybe you need a new computer.
Probably.
Is there anyone you could ask about that?
No one who would listen. Okay. Sorry about that, everybody. That was very weird.
We just hit on everything.
Yeah,
in
we're
that
done.
time. So that was great. Great session, everybody. All the
Father Nick, do you want to conclude us in prayer? We're done here. So
yes,
Father, why don't you ask your question and we'll jump back in.
So St. Paul is clearly talking about himself, but are the Corinthians especially, or I guess as we've read it, anyone not reading this as if Paul is talking about himself?
Mm-hmm. I haven't seen in the fathers of the church and even the modern scholars, no one has any inkling that this is not clearly Paul referring to himself, but trying not to refer to himself. Like it's very, very clear. In the same way that, like we joked about, I'm asking for a friend.
Right.
Like, you clearly know that person's asking for themselves, but they present it, and for whatever reason, they present it this way. So I don't think that it would have been lost in the Corinthians of what he's talking about.
Okay.
Because he's literally talking about himself the whole time, except for this 1 second, this one,
I know
one
a man.
sentence. Yeah, I know a guy. I'm not going to boast. I swear there's no point in me boasting, but I know a guy who went up to heaven, but you've made me boast now. So he literally comments later, like, well, now I'm boasting.
Hope you're happy.
Yeah.
Oh boy.
Yeah, and that's interesting, right? Just in terms of like that credibility, because on some level, right? I mean, like this is a way that he's taking this kind of like need, right, that the Corinthians have, and he's reframing it in terms of like the actual revelation that Christ gives us. Because again, like that kind of language is very consistent with what we see in the call of the prophets in the Old Testament. It's very similar to like his experience on the road to Damascus as well. Like there's this ecstatic, real sort of revelation. Like I'm called up into this thing, like Elijah being called to the throne of God, right? I mean, like this is the way the prophets were called before they were sent forth. So he's doing this thing and saying this thing, which is very consistent with the way God is constantly revealing himself. And it's an interesting contrast, I guess, with this, the posturing that's going on amongst these false prophets, these Hyperlian, whatever it is, the super.
Hyperlian apostoli. Super apostles.
Yeah.
I imagine them wearing capes.
With glowing hair, like Super Saiyans.
I'm
Dragon
not
Ball?
big into, no, I'm not, no.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
You could have gone
like
Incredibles.
Superheroes, super mundane. Okay, so the humble brag. And then hold on, I was gonna pull something else up, and well, I don't know. Have we covered enough of that?
I think so, to a certain extent.
Okay. All right. So now I'd like to get into what is going on here. Right. So what is he talking about? We're talking about this happening, but 14 years ago, he was caught up to the third heaven. Not to be confused with seventh heaven, which was a TV show. Just the mention of the TV show, he's gone.
What a great reference.
Am I the only one who thought of that?
No.
When they thought third heaven? Okay, right. It seems like the natural thing to think about. So this third heaven, I mean, is there a first, second heaven that come before the third heaven?
So from what I've read, the phrase third heaven is a classic Jewish expression for like the closest proximity to God's presence, right? As Steve was talking about, being, the prophets being called before the throne of God in order to receive their commission, for lack of a better word, to go out and bring the word of God. that image of the third heaven is used within Jewish terminology to refer to literally standing immediately in front of the presence of God.
Okay.
Yeah.
And he speaks of this, and obviously, okay, we've talked about like the non-boast boast. I mean, I don't know, waited 14 years to write about this. I don't know who else he's told.
There's something to that as well. That's worth unpacking.
There is, yeah. Christoforou has some good stuff about that.
Yeah. He I did read a little bit about that. But that seems like a pretty big deal. I mean, like it's mentioned almost, I don't want to say it's glossed over because he's talking about it, but does this happen to other people? Is this something that goes on at some other point with anybody else?
I mean, we see it throughout we've kind of mentioned already, we see it throughout the scriptures. This is not unique, it's not a unique experience.
But we've seen this where they go up and come back, and we don't know if it's in the body or not out of the body. I mean, it's that's the way he describes it as this going up to heaven. But the image that he's using, right, to take that going up to the third heaven and standing before the throne of God, that's an image that happens again with Isaiah, with Ezekiel. Right. It happens with Samuel, and then it happens with John, the theologian, right? Going and having a vision before the throne of God. So this is very, as Steve pointed out, like this is very consistent with heavenly visions. Okay. So okay. I don't know why I'm like baffled by this whole thing.
I don't either.
I am.
It seems pretty easy to accept. I don't know why.
Why? It's not that I don't accept it.
I don't know why you would struggle.
I
don't know why you struggle with the fact that a human being would be brought before the throne of God and see wonders that the human mind cannot speak of. Why is that baffling to you?
Because why?
It's just a flaming chariot and a wheel covered in eyes, and
no, I mean, like, what's the point?
What is the point? He just says he can't tell you about it, though. He says it happens. It happened, but I can't tell you about it.
Right. Yeah. And there's things that were said.
My girlfriend, she lives in Canada.
She goes to another school.
She's real.
Yeah, which is that tension, right, between like this thing, because contrast this with the way that it is described by the other prophets, right? Like I was joking about the wheels with the eyes on them and so forth. Like when you get this like attempt by Isaiah, right, and the others to describe this thing, I mean, how do you describe a heavenly reality in terms of like in human terms, right? Even to say up, right? It's not like if I was to blast a rocket ship up, I would eventually like reach the third heaven, right? But there's this sense of the grandeur of like God above us, right, as being bigger than us or whatever it is. So we use this word which conveys something, even if it doesn't necessarily in a little literal sense convey something. Like, I don't know, how does one describe the indescribable, right? How does one like when he talks about the words that he heard, but like words that were not uttered with words. I mean, how do you describe non-human language, non-word words, right? There's sort of a reverential like mystery to this, which I think also is a contrast to the false revelations that you would get from the others. I mean, I would imagine that they don't have the same level of grandeur to them.
What I think is important to note about these, especially the ones that we have referenced scripturally, is the experience is always a commission, right? These people are brought, the prophets, Paul, St. John, they're brought before the throne of God for the purpose then of delivering the gospel to others, to actually then go forth, not just of their own accord, right? So this again, that separates St. Paul's experience from the super apostles, because he has been commissioned by God in order to go out and preach. John has been commissioned by God in order to share the revelation. Isaiah and Ezekiel and Samuel have been commissioned to become prophets of the Lord. So the question of why this type of experience, what is being described consistently across the board in these instances in the scriptures is a commissioning, right? It's a sending out in order to do that. In the same way that, when the missionaries went to the Rus, right? They were Constantinopolitan monks who were sent out by the patriarch and by the emperor, right? They came to the center of the city, stood in front of the emperor and the patriarch, and received their commission to go baptize the Slavs, right? In the same way that anyone who is going on a mission on behalf of another first goes in front of them to receive the details in that commission and then goes out.
Okay.
Yeah, that's I think
so that's
really
the
important.
why. I mean, to your point, that's the why. And that again is the point of contrast between St. Paul and the super apostles.
Okay.
He's been commissioned by God. It's not him. And so when he says that I have nothing to boast about, he's right, because he didn't initiate this. Right. This is not like, oh, I think it would be a good idea if I go out and preach. He was brought before the throne of God and told to go and preach. In the same way that the apostles were, right? Is you look at the ascension, and the commission that happens at the ascension is Christ is ascending. What is he doing but sitting on his throne, ascending back to his
in
Father?
The clouds, right? Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's really no different than being standing in the presence of God, receiving a commission, and then they become apostles.
Yeah. Yeah.
These super apostles had none of that. They had themselves.
Right. So this 14-year thing. So he's saying this 14 years later. So tell me more about the importance of that.
So St. John Chrysostom talks about how essentially Paul kept this experience to himself until it was necessary for him to bring it out and share it. And it was, again, it's a pastoral consideration by St. Paul to share this story at this time to people who are looking for heavenly visions because of what their for lack of a better word, Pentecostal experience of their local church, but also because they're being led astray by these super apostles. So they need to hear this story more than St. Paul needs to tell the story. He only tells the story when need compels him. And so at the end of his homily on this section of 2 Corinthians, St. John says, I'll quote it, and he says, "Let us also learn to be modest and not to glory at any time in wealth or other worldly things, but in the reproaches we suffer for Christ's sake, and in these things only when need compels. For if there be nothing urging it, let us not mention even these, lest we be puffed up." So he's making the case, and he kind of concludes with that St. Paul never told this story out of a sense of everything he's talking about, which is, I'm not boasting about myself. I'm not boasting about my experience. I'm not even using this as an evangelical tool. I'm not going out. I mean, theoretically, St. Paul could go to every new community that he goes to and says, listen to me, I was brought into the third heaven and I stood before the throne of God, and I can, I bring you a message from Christ and him crucified and resurrected, right? Like, he doesn't use that as a rhetorical tool in his preaching. He saves it for when it's needed for this particular group to overcome their tendency towards people who boast.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I think that's one really, really important angle. And I think we can also connect this with something that we read about, or that St. Silouan the Athonite used to talk about. Like in the life of St. Silouan, there's this bit as St. Sophrony is understanding this and unpacking this idea of dogmatic consciousness that he talks about, how there's a time between this revelation that we have and the way that we sort of assimilate it and actually grow in a dogmatic consciousness rather than a philosophical consciousness. And St. Silouan or St. Sophrony in this is if you look at the writers of the New Testament from when they were commissioned to when they began writing these things down, it's about 15 years. Paul, from the road to Damascus experience to what is it? The Thessalonians, I think, like whatever is the first epistle that we have, it's about 15 years. And even here, like Paul is giving us this kind of like lag time, that one of the marks of somebody who actually has like a religious experience is that it is something that is like a seed that develops and grows over time. These are not like spiritual novices who are out there talking about these things. Like this is somebody who's been germinating upon this thing for a long, long time. And it's the difference between that intellectual sort of philosophical consciousness and what Saint Sophrony calls dogmatic consciousness. And Saint Silouan's rule of thumb was always about 15 years. And to me, I think it's interesting that here we have this like from seed to sort of fruit, this very long window, as opposed to, who knows, these other Corinthians who were out there like boasting. They weren't spending years in the wilderness praying, fasting, opening themselves up. It's just, here I am.
Yeah. And some of the other fathers talk about that as well. And they say essentially, if St. Paul had this experience 14 years ago, imagine who he is when he's writing this letter, right? If he was brought before the throne of God 14 years ago and has spent every moment since living the evangelical commission that he's received, then how much more should the Corinthians listen to what he has to say than if he just had this experience and showed up recently, which the super apostles, they're referred to as like arriving recently in Corinth, right? He's got a long history with the Corinthians, and he's got an even longer history as a commissioned mouthpiece of God, for lack of a better term.
Yeah. Which again, these are all signs as like people who are looking for spiritual direction, right? Who I think struggle, because there's always going to be people like those random Corinthians who are presenting themselves. Like this actually becomes kind of an interesting, not template necessarily, right? But like we should be looking for people who are like St. Paul rather than the sort of the Johnny come lately, other, Corinthian pseudo preachers, the super apostles. I mean, like I've been thinking about this actually too, in terms of the parable of the sower. If you think about like the fruit that comes, the growth that comes from those plants, they grow when they fall into the rocky soil. They grow when they fall onto the not the path. That's when the birds take them. But they grow in all these places. But it's time that tells the difference between this growth that is arrested versus this growth that bears fruit. And there might be kind of a flashy short-term growth, right? Those other Corinthians were out there telling these stories and so forth and so on. But this isn't real fruit in the deepest sense. It takes time. It takes steadfastness, right? It takes this contrite heart that has been ground down into powder. 15 years, 14 years, whatever it is.
So after 14 to 15 years, everybody's ready to go.
I mean, we also can't like over literalize it. Yeah.
I know. I'm making a joke.
No, but it's good to say that. It's not like, hey, here I am after 15 years in the incubator. I'm ready to go.
Right.
I've done my time. I did my nickel.
Nickel and a dime.
Yeah. Nickel and a dime in the clink. Yes. Worst part was the Dementors.
So now we move on to the weakness of St. Paul, and this, in order to not be too elated, right? So he's not too elated by the abundance of revelations. A thorn was given to me in the flesh. What's he talking about here?
That's a great question, right? Because I think like there's different glosses on this from different people.
I've heard that, that there's actual like pain that he's experienced. And I also heard that it was, just those who would slander him or speak against him, or, literal messengers, if you will, of Satan, those who you'd slander, those are like people. So I don't know if there's a which is it, or if it's a yes, or, I think St. John Chrysostom said, when he says 3 times I asked, it was really more like just many. It's not necessarily like 3 times and they gave up. But, there's this constant struggle that St. Paul's going through, that he's calling on God to remove, and that's just not happening.
Yeah.
Yes. So there's, like you said, there's kind of two classical ways that we can interpret this. And I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. So we should remember that. And the first is as St. John Chrysostom, and the majority, this is the overwhelming majority of the fathers in the church, or the interpretation according to the fathers of the church, is kind of like etymologically based. So the word Satan means adversary. And even Chrysostom, when he comments on this section, goes back to the Old Testament and the Hebrew uses of the word Satana, which is adversary. So what he's saying is, there was this thorn in my, was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan, or of the adversaries, to harass me and keep me from being too elated. So many of the fathers, the majority of them, say this quote unquote thorn in the flesh are the people, i.e. the super apostles, but also the Gentiles that he's going to come into contact with in majority Gentile cities when he's, harassed in Ephesus, people who are not part of the church who will harass him as well. The Judaizers that anyone who's opposed to, who stands in opposition or as an adversary to the missionary work of St. Paul. This is the standard patristic interpretation of this. And it's based on the fact that, these people are acting as adversaries, or quote unquote Satans, and they're a thorn in his side. They are a pain that he cannot get rid of. So again, to comment on this, when God says, that his grace is sufficient for you, St. John Chrysostom takes this and kind of ad libs, expands on what God is saying. And he says, quote, "That is to say, it is sufficient for you that you raise the dead, that you cure the blind, that you cleanse leopard, that you work miracles. Seek not also exemption from danger and fear, and to preach without annoyance. You seek therefore a thing which is not only not needed, but which also obscures the glory of my power." So asking to be relieved of adversaries is essentially, according to St. John Chrysostom, what God is telling St. Paul is that's not reasonable. It's not reasonable for you to go around and preach and to heal and to do my work and not face opposition. Because if you remember, my son said, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you. So it's not exactly reasonable for you not to have adversaries. And secondly, the growth of the church in the face of adversity and adversaries shows my power, shows the glory of my gospel, shows the glory of the salvation that I bring through you, right? So in fact, if we were to take away all these adversaries, you would actually be downplaying the glory that comes with proclaiming the gospel.
For Christ's sake, right? Rather than for the sake of the worldly regard or whatever it is. I think that's, which again, kind of ties in with that long suffering theme that we've seen.
Right. Then you get the other option, which is
before we get to the other theme, just maybe even to build on this, right? I think we can also read this in terms of just sort of the overarching direction of our lives, because you see sometimes, I think it's John in his gospel. Well, I think he calls Judas, the son of Satan or whatever.
Son of perdition.
Son of perdition. Yeah. I think there's kind of an interesting sort of parallelism, right? As we are doing the works of Christ, we've talked about this in recent weeks, we are members of his body who are doing his work. We are that's theosis, right? We are sort of becoming deified. We are moving in this direction as we're moving towards the Lord. Whereas what does it mean to do the works of the evil one, right? What does it mean to sort of stand in the way of the gospel that Christ is proclaiming, right? I think we can also potentially think about this in terms of that, a life that is dedicated towards theosis or a life that is dedicated towards anti-theosis. That some of these people who are standing in the way of the gospel, the false prophets, the pagans, the whatever it is, we can see them as messengers of Satan or followers of Satan, or even becoming satanified, right? Because they are opposing Christ. It's not a particularly elegant word, but I mean, I
You're
think
just
there's
trying
kind of,
very, very hard not to duplicate. And I appreciate your different word choice. I see what you're doing there. You don't want to have to cite your sources.
I think, I don't know. I think there's something to that.
Okay. So option number 2.
Option 2, 1 or 2, 2 or 1. Anyway,
Riveting for the podcast listeners.
yes. Galatians 4:13 through 15. This is St. Paul writing to the Galatians, and he says, "You know that because of physical infirmity, I preached the gospel to you at first. And my trial, which was in my flesh, you did not despise nor reject, but you received me as an angel of God, even as Christ Jesus. That what then was the blessing you enjoyed? For I bear you witness that if possible, you would have plucked out your own eyes and given them to me." So he's making reference to his flesh and his physical infirmity in his flesh. That line, this might be a stretch, but this is how modern scholars look at this. That line plus Galatians 6:11, which is one of my favorite lines, and just yeah, see with what large letters I am writing you with my own hand. Actually leads some to believe that this was some type of eye affliction, that he literally had a physical infirmity of his eyes, and because of the great love for the Galatians, they would have taken their own eyes and given it to him. So as evidence of some type of injury. And the fact that he refers to it as like his trial in his flesh and the thorn in the flesh, scholars see these two, the word usage here, as linking the two. That this is a common way St. Paul refers to whatever it is that he's suffering with, and there's some physical infirmity that he's asking God to take away, and God is not taking away either that or adversaries. And I don't think they're mutually exclusive, whether he had an eye infirmity or not. Scholars and the fathers of the church that do take the more physical approach are all very clear that like any identification is purely conjecture, and no one really has a good, strong idea or understanding of what this is if it's something physical. But Paul definitely refers to some physical infirmities throughout his ministry. And so it would make sense that this could possibly refer to that.
I don't know if you remember, like back in the 90s or early 2000s, whenever it was, like there for a while, people were trying to say this was like stigmata, and there was that sort of like, quasi sort of like, there's a horror movie by the same name,
Yeah, I remember
Stigmata,
that.
right? There were people for a particular season who were trying to like read this as that, like it was the, but whatever.
Nails in the flesh kind of deal.
Yeah. The thorn in the flesh was actually like a nail in the flesh, which was actually stigmata or whatever it is. But
right.
These are stretches that are sort of reading into the text rather than actually trying to engage with the text.
And to what point and purpose?
The point, well, what I was
for the stigmata stuff, I mean, saying,
yeah.
It's clear that from St. Paul's writings that he does make reference to some physical, like, discomfort that he carries with him. The fact that the man has been beaten and imprisoned so many times probably has resulted in him not being in the best health, understandably, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And it's just, but those are the things when he kind of has the freedom to boast. What he says, and the important part is that that's the stuff that he prefers to boast on. And we've seen earlier in Corinthians, earlier in our discussion of Corinthians, right, a couple episodes back, that this is just a constant theme, that when he has the opportunity to boast, he chooses to boast about his weakness and the grace of God that shows forth in spite of him, or maybe because of his weakness, right? That God chooses, and we see this again in Corinthians, that God chooses weakness in order to manifest his glory, because that requires a different response from us, right? We need to choose to love a God who suffers for us, as opposed to fear and cower in front of a God who appears in all of his glory and demands that we bow down in front of him because he is almighty, right? It's a very different response on the part of the humans who are called to love him. We can actually love him when he presents himself to us through weakness as opposed to force.
Yeah. Which is such a contrast between, the actual God, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, versus the gods of the philosophers and the gods of the idolaters and the
gods of this world, like the people who said, right, in terms of what this gives us for our daily lives is, a couple of things. Number one, to take Chrysostom's point, is like, you can only boast about good things when it's really, really necessary, right? When there's actually a point, because St. Paul sat on this story for 14 years and we have no evidence he ever talked about it again, right? It was necessary at this point to share that, and that was it. And then he immediately moved off of it, and he tried to push as much of it off of himself as he could. And the rest of the time he spends pointing to the way that God works through him and through his weakness.
And this is used, this particular, and maybe at the time too, these particular verses is used today in a sense of encouragement when I guess I don't know, we're suffering a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I think,
is that appropriate?
Well, here, let me pull this into it, and then maybe I'll come back to it. What's important to note is that when St. Paul boasts about his weakness, it's always back in reference to how God works through that weakness. Right. It's not self-deprecation for the purpose of self-deprecation, because that also turns into pride. We've all been around those people who are so self-deprecating that you're clearly like don't mean what you're saying, or you're being so self-deprecating in order to turn the attention to you, right? I'm saying falsehoods, false humility in order to hear the praises of people who tell me like, no, that's not, I'm the worst, I'm the worst ever. No, you're not. You're great. Right. Like, oh, thanks. I need to hear that.
Is there a doctor in the house? No, I'm not a doctor. Yes, you are.
Oh man, if only we were on an airplane.
Don't call me Shirley.
Oh, it's from Curb. You haven't seen that Curb yet then, have you?
No, I know I haven't.
Oh yeah. Larry's on a flight and someone's having a heart attack, and he's sitting next to a doctor, and the doctor refuses to acknowledge that he's a doctor because he doesn't want to end up like at a airport Howard Johnson in Reno. And it's like, have you ever like been in an emergency landing? Like, I'm not staying overnight in Reno. Anyway, this same man then ends up having to give a speech, and he needs some jokes. And Larry's sitting at his table for a benefit dinner, and Larry refuses to acknowledge that he's a comedian and write jokes for this man. Anyway,
it's so good.
Back to what I was saying. Is every time Paul boasts of his weakness, he always then references back to the power and glory of God that is present and works through that, which is an important lesson for us, because we can hear that we should boast of our weakness. But if that weakness is not also filled with the strength of Christ, then we're fulfilling false humility and ultimately pride. Right? It can be prideful to constantly put ourselves down or to project a boast of weakness if we're not also then referencing back to God. If the point of my talking about my weakness is to talk about me, then you've missed it.
Right.
Yeah.
So
I don't know if that addressed your question, Father Nick, but
No, I think it does. I think that's, it's there's strength that can be found there. There's encouragement that can be found there. And
but the encouragement comes
Christ
not through
is found there.
Right. The encouragement comes through the reference of our suffering back to Christ. Right. This is exactly what, that like extrapolated conversation that St. John Chrysostom uses in his homily, where he talks about like, you take away or you undermine the glory of my work when you ask for these things to be taken away. And the point being that it's the reference back to Christ. It's the reference back to God that gives meaning. So we shouldn't just use like, well, we shouldn't use suffering we shouldn't use these to encourage or to try and bolster someone while they're suffering if we're not also then connecting their suffering to Christ and to his power, right? Like just telling somebody that they're going to suffer because, oh, look, St. Paul suffered. Why do you think you're better than St. Paul? Like that's garbage. That's garbage pastoral care.
Right.
But to then connect their personal suffering with the power of God and his presence in there. And for some, we might reject God's presence in the midst of our suffering. So then the response, the encouragement becomes to once again discover his presence in the midst of your suffering. I don't know if that makes sense.
I think so. I think it's a good place to wrap up too.
Yeah.
I contributed nothing to this podcast today.
You asked the prompting questions. That was needed. I just talked and talked and talked.
No, I needed that today. Today was my
and it was your day off.
It was my I needed to learn.
It's a Sabbath.
I think the problem is you didn't have your cookies. I think your blood sugar is low. Yeah, you're just not ready.
I just needed to. I need to absorb today. Today was an absorption day. So, all right,
like a cookie and a glass of milk.
Right, soaking up the milk.
Grandpa's grumpy. He hasn't had his cookies today.
If you do it too long, it'll fall into the milk, and now you got a big chunk of cookie in your milk, which is also delicious.
Depends on the structure of the cookie.
Right.
The structural integrity of the cookie could.
Do you have non-soluble cookies that refuse to dissolve?
I mean, how long are you talking? I'm not going to sit there for 5 minutes with my cookie sitting in the milk, but I mean, like, I've had some good, strong cookies that don't break down.
Yeah. Like a Chips Ahoy won't last.
Yeah, it's not gonna. Right.
How indignant you were in that
one
moment.
of those big ones in there.
Yeah,
you have to break it in half to fit into the cup.
Christian sent us cookies for the twins' birthday, and they were, I mean, that thing I needed like a mason jar in order to fit the cookie inside the.
Have you ever done like the sugar cookie that has like the frosting that is like really thick, but the cookie itself isn't? So like the frosting is keeping the cookie connected to the rest of the cookie.
Yeah, like the grocery store.
Right.
Standard. Yeah.
Most of the time,
I've never dipped those.
Most of them, you don't dip those to dip every kind of cookie. I'm a dunker. I don't care what I'm going to dunk it to. It's going to dunk. I dunk my pizza crust in my pop. True story.
That's disgusting.
It's wonderful.
My grandmother used to dip her bread in her soda. Yeah.
Wow, no way. All
That's
right.
gross.
I thought you were gonna come at me, Steve.
No. She was a diabetic, but like.
Yeah. Okay.
Probably should sign us off now. That's fair.
Father Nick, will you?
In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, now and forever, to the ages of ages. Amen. Christ our God, we thank you for gathering us, the three of us here together today, that we may learn and grow in mind and heart towards you and in your knowledge of you. We pray to meet back here in a week for more of your knowledge, for your holy always, now and forever, to the ages of ages.
Amen. Minus technical difficulties and the breaking up of this episode into 2 videos on YouTube. I apologize.
You should boast of your weaknesses.
Shame. Dum dum.